안녕하십니까. 저는 선거연수원 시민교육부 이은정 사무관입니다. 오늘 중앙선거관리위원회 선거연수원과 한국정당학회가 공동으로 주최하는 2023년 민주시민교육 국제심포지엄에 참석해 주신 여러분께 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 민주시민교육 국제심포지엄은 세계 각국의 전문가들이 함께 모여 민주시민 교육을 논의하는 자리로 2005년 이후 매년 개최하여 왔습니다. 이번 심포지엄의 주제는 정치적 양극화 시대의 민주시민 교육입니다. 그럼 오늘 행사의 진행 순서를 말씀드리겠습니다. 먼저 김대일 선거연수원장님의 개회사와 엄기홍 한국정당학회장님의 축사가 있겠습니다. 그 다음 정치적 양극화 시대의 민주시민 교육에 대해 독일, 일본, 호주의 사례를 공유하는 발제 시간을 가진 후 질의응답 및 의견 청취가 있겠습니다. 심포지엄은 한국어, 영어, 동시 통역으로 진행되며 앞에 놓인 수신기를 이용하시면 통역된 언어로 들으실 수 있습니다. 지금부터 2023년 민주시민교육 국제심포지엄 개회식을 시작하겠습니다. 먼저 선거연수원 김대일 원장님의 개회사가 있겠습니다. 큰 박수로 환영하여 주시기 바랍니다.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dale Kim, the Chairman of the Korean Civic Education Institute for Democracy. I'm very happy to co-host the 2023 International Virtual Symposium on Civic Education for Democracy with the Korean Association of Party Studies. First of all, I would like to express my heartfelt appreciation to Dr. Ki-hong the head of the Korean Association of Party Studies. He wholeheartedly supported and sponsored this event. I would also like to extend my sincere gratitude to the esteemed professors who will participate in the presentation and discussion. This symposium started 18 years ago in 2005. There has been a lot of discussion about civic education and democracy. I hope this event will also serve as a beneficial relationship experts from around the world to gather together to share profound insights and expertise for the development of civic education. These days, we are witnessing a deepening political polarization that leads to social conflict and division. This is not just confined to Korea alone, but is common in many countries around the world. Hostility and distrust towards individuals solely based upon their political affiliation or different perspectives on social issues have become increasingly prevalent. As this phenomenon poses a significant threat to the democratic values, a growing number of governments are now recognizing the urgency to address this issue. So, we are going to hold a symposium this year under the theme of civic education for democracy in the age of political polarization. Our goal is to explore and in-depth discuss global case studies on the role and the direction of civic education in solving the immediate challenges posed by political polarization. Once again, I'd like to express my deep appreciation to professors who join in this annual event in the midst of their busy schedule. Special thanks to the Honorable Overseas guest, Dr. Aurel Croissant, Dr. Tsutsumi Hidenori, and Dr. Jean-Paul Gagnon. Wish you all the best and happiness. Thank you.
다음은 한국정당학회 엄기홍 회장님의 축사가 있겠습니다. 많은 박수로 맞이하여 주시기 바랍니다.
예, 안녕하십니까. 한국정당학회 회장 엄기홍이라고 합니다. 다들 아시겠지만 지금의 정치, 한국의 정치뿐만 아니라 세계의 정치 모두 이 정치라는 것이 문제를 해결하는 장소가 아니라 문제를 일으키는 장소가 되고 있는 것 같습니다. 갈등 해소를 위해서 정치가 있는 것이 아니라 갈등을 조장하는 것이 바로 정치인 것 같습니다. 정치가 이렇게 된 가장 큰 이유는 아마 정치인들에게 있다고 생각을 합니다. 정서적으로 정치인들이 정서적으로 그리고 이념적으로 양극화되어 있기 때문이죠. 정치인들 사이에 이념적이고 그리고 정서적인 양극화가 심해져서 더 이상 대화의 시도조차 해볼 수 없는 상황인 것 같습니다. 따라서 지금은 유권자의 현명한 판단이 어느 때보다도 요구되는 상황인 것 같습니다. 유권자가 정치의 본질인 타협과 상호 존중을 이해를 하고 그렇게 말하는 정치인들을 선발해야 되지 않을까 생각을 합니다. 그래서 유권자는 더 이상 그 자기 집토끼, 소위 자기 지지만을 선발하는 이야기하는 정치인들을 선발하기보다는 이런 상호 존중과 이해를 바탕으로 하는 정치인들을 선발했으면 좋겠습니다. 그래서 저희들이 생각 한국정당학회와 선거관리위원회 선거연수원이 생각하기에는 이러한 유권자가 어느 때보다도 중요한 시기이기 때문에 시민 교육이 어느 때보다도 중요하다고 생각이 됩니다. 그래서 이번 기회가 중앙선거관리위원회와 같이 하는 정당학회와 같이 하는 이번 기회가 이러한 유권자를 양성하고 기를 수 있는 그런 기회가 됐으면 좋겠습니다. 아울러서 한국 정치의 문제점을 해결함과 더불어 지금 세계 각국에서 벌어지고 있는 정치 양극화에 대한 해결의 단초도 같이 제시했으면 좋겠습니다. 고맙습니다.
지금부터는 오늘 참석하신 사회자와 토론자를 무대에 모시겠습니다. 나와주시기 바랍니다. 그럼 먼저 사회자를 소개해 드리겠습니다. 건국대학교 이현출 교수님이십니다. 교수님은 현재 한국지방의회학회 회장 및 국민통합위원회 위원으로 활동하고 계십니다. 다음은 토론자를 소개해 드리겠습니다. 숭실대학교 신정섭 교수님이십니다. 교수님은 한국정당학회 및 한국선거학회 연구이사를 맡고 계십니다. 한국외국어대학교 한성민 교수님이십니다. 교수님은 중국 상해 재경대학교 조교수를 역임하셨습니다. 마지막으로 선거연수원 장성훈 교수님이십니다. 교수님은 중앙선거관리위원회 상임위원 및 사무총장 비서관을 역임하셨습니다. 이제부터 본격적으로 정치적 양극화 시대의 민주시민 교육에 대해 발제 및 토론 시간을 갖겠습니다. 지금부터 사회는 이현출 교수님께서 맡아 진행해 주시겠습니다.
네, 안녕하십니까. 방금 소개받은 건국대학교 이현출 교수입니다. 반갑습니다. 네, 저희들이 약 2시간 정도 시간이 배정이 되어 있습니다. 먼저 1시간에 걸쳐서 세 분의 발제자의 발표를 들으시고 오늘 이 자리에 모신 세 분의 토론자로부터 질의응답을 갖는 순서로 진행을 하도록 그렇게 하겠습니다. 오늘 시간 제약 때문에 우선 각 발표자 선생님들께는 15분씩 발표의 시간을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 그래서 먼저 하이델베르그 대학의 정치학 교수이신 아우렐 크라상 교수님의 발제가 있겠습니다. 아우렐 크라상 선생님은 현재 독일 하이델베르그 대학교 사회정치학과 교수님으로 재직 중에 계십니다. 준비되셨죠?
Okay, thank you so much. 안녕하세요, and good afternoon, everyone. And the topic of my presentation today is polarization and civic education in Germany, challenges and opportunities. As has been mentioned at the beginning of this panel, there is a general concern among scholars in Asia and Western democracies that polarization is increasingly characterizing democratic societies and their politics all over the world. Political polarization in Germany, as I will show you, is less pronounced than, for example, in the United States. And warnings against a breakdown of German democracy, another Weimar, meaning Weimar Republic, the German first democracy, which broke down in 1933 because of polarization between radical right and radical left, are certainly exaggerated. Nonetheless, there are worrying trends in many Western democracies and Asian democracies, and also in Germany. There is polarization in Germany as well, and it poses new challenges for political education. I will proceed with my presentation in 4 steps. First, I will discuss briefly polarization in Germany. Second, I will briefly discuss the civic education system in Germany. And then third, the role of civic education in a moderately polarizing society like Germany. I will finally close with a summary and a brief outlook. So let me begin with some discussion of polarization in Germany. Of course, before we can discuss the levels and forms of polarization in Germany, we have to define what polarization actually means. And when defining polarization, it is important to keep in mind that some distance between political opinions, views, and demands is simply inevitable in a pluralistic democracy. Constructive conflict and questioning of positions are inherent qualities of a democratic society. However, polarization, especially extensive polarization and pernicious polarization, is then a problem for democracy, constitutes a challenge for democracy. Polarization, as usually defined in political science, comparative politics, encompasses various phenomena that, depending on the perspective, relate to the political distance resulting from political, social, cultural, or economic developments. There are different forms of polarization. For example, as you see here in the table, polarization of political opinions, or another form of polarization, partisan polarization, when electorates identify with a party based on their ideological, racial, religious, gender, or other demographic characteristics. Third, there's mass polarization. That's an electorate's attitudes towards political issues or policies neatly divide along party lines, liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats. And finally, there is affective polarization, which means that persons who identify as members of one political camp dislike or distrust those from other political camps or parties. From a cross-regional perspective, the question is, of course, how do we measure polarization? What are indicators and measurement tools that allow us actually to compare forms and levels of polarization across countries? One approach that I find particularly useful for cross-country comparison is that of the Varieties of Democracy VDEM project. In contrast to opinion polls, VDEM data is expert-coded data. So it does not reflect the answers of respondents in a representative public opinion poll, but it represents the opinion of experts who code certain indicators that aim to measure polarization. 2 indicators are relevant in our context. One is political or affective polarization. Is society polarized into antagonist political camps? And the other is social or opinion-based polarization. As you see here, polarization in Germany compared to South Korea and the United States of America is less severe than in these 2 other countries. Here, higher scores indicate more political polarization, and the blue line is Germany. You see there's an increase or a deepening of polarization after 2014. 2014 is the year when the right-wing populist party Alternative for Germany, AfD, for the first time competed in elections, but it's clearly below the level of the United States or South Korea, according to VDEM data. A similar picture emerges if we look at polarization of society. Here, higher scores indicate less polarization of opinion. And again, Germany also exhibits a increasing polarization of society, but below the levels of South Korea and the United States of America. Another way to measure polarization is, of course, using representative opinion polls, like the KAS Konrad Adenauer Stiftung study from 2021, which I will show you on the next two slides. The main findings of those opinion polls and opinion data is that German society is perceived as increasingly polarized on political issues. Representative surveys before the pandemic and during the pandemic, as well as the results from other representative surveys, show an increase in political polarization over the long term, starting, however, from a relatively low level. As you see here, in terms of polarized opinions or political views, a majority of Germans represents middle positions, although the representation of fringe positions and especially left-wing positions has increased in recent years. So interestingly, while after 2014, the right-wing, right nationalist populist party, AfD, became a relevant political party, the political climate in Germany has actually turned a little bit more to the left. And partisan polarization is also a fact of political life, daily political life in Germany, but issues that lead to increased polarizations are especially inequality issues, the contrast between rich and poor, migration policy, and climate protection. With regard to effective polarization, as in Korea, political parties in Germany do not arouse great enthusiasm among many, but neither do they arouse any overriding aversion. Even when comparing the right-wing AfD and the left-wing Left, Die Linke, that is the parties on the far right and the far left of German party spectrum, the majority of respondents remain neutral and only a minority reject the other side. Openness to political discussions, change of opinions, and compromise, however, do not reach everyone. Part of the opinion and party spectrum is largely excluded from the overlap of views and openness to interaction and excludes itself. So the bottom line is polarization is increasing, but it's still at a relatively moderate level. So what are causes for polarization in Germany? Of course, this is a contested issue. Important is to keep in mind that COVID-19 pandemic is not the main driver of polarization. It's perhaps an accelerator of earlier developments. The literature on polarization in Germany usually sees or identifies four driving forces, four main factors of polarization. One is globalization 2.0, which deepens economic inequalities in Germany, as in other Western democracies. Second, growing economic inequalities, which often translate into social and political inequalities as well. Third, a perceived or even measurable economic loss, which coincides with perceived threats to one's own identities, so the angry white man, identity and economic interest overlap. And fourth, integrative or at least moderating institutions in German democracy, like political parties, churches, family, lose their binding power, which also contributes to polarization. So let me briefly discuss the civic education system in Germany. Civic education as an element of political socialization, according to the German understanding, contributes to the acquisition of those values, attitudes, convictions, knowledge, and dispositions for action that are considered necessary for understanding and for the stability of the political order of a society. Civic education in Germany takes place primarily in school lessons and in the increasingly differentiated offerings of extracurricular youth and adult education. In addition, political education in Germany also takes place, for example, in programs to promote democracy and prevent extremism run by states, the federal government, and local authorities. As you know, Germany is a federal system, though the federal agency for civic education, called Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung, is a federal public authority providing citizenship education and information on political issues for all people in Germany. Due to its federal structure, education in Germany lies within the sovereignty of the 16 federal state governments. However, the ministers of education and cultural affairs of the individual states who are responsible for civic education at the state level have reached an agreement on and a joint declaration defining the main purpose of civic education in Germany. In Germany, a common self-conception for school-based citizenship education has established itself in recent decades, which is based on three basic principles. That's the so-called Beutelsbach consensus. First, the prohibition against overwhelming. Second, the understanding that controversial subjects have to be treated as controversial. And third, that the main aim of civic education is to enable students, young adults, citizens to develop their own personal interests in politics. So civic education in Germany is supposed to initiate learning processes aimed at democratic participation, discourse skills, representation of interests, and political agency. So what is the role of civic education in a moderately polarizing society such as Germany? Polarization is, in Germany as in other countries, generally seen as a challenge, if not as a threat to democracy. The task of civic education from a German perspective is to participate in a contemporary, appropriate, and democratic response to polarization processes and to promote openness and ambiguity, tolerance with regard to lived plurality. The political or public expectation is often one of civic education and civic educators as kind of a 9/11 firefighters who counter polarization processes or deal with acute symptoms of polarization. This expectation is, I think, unwarranted. Civic education cannot become civic educators a 9/11 firefighter who directly block polarization and fight with immediate consequences and impact symptoms of polarization. Civic education, however, can contribute to learning to distinguish between mechanisms of democratic judgment and preference formation and other or shame democratic forms of judgment and will formation. Civic education can provide information about how democratic legitimacy is created and eroded, and about the fundamental values and principles of a democratic society. So how should polarization be dealt with in civic education from a German perspective? And of course, there are also many debates about that in Germany. There is a consensus, nonetheless, in the field of didactics in Germany that civic education in schools should not be limited to institutional studies. So civic education is more than constitutional text study. What is disputed, however, is the extent to which schools should and may become spaces or even agents of social transformation. Contrary to what is often claimed, the guidelines for civic education in German schools by no means impose an obligation to Weltanschauungsneutrality. In dealing with polarization, civic education has to take a pro-democratic stance. But no general solutions about what school can or must do in the face of political and social polarization exists in the German discourse. In sum, civic education can provide opportunities and spaces for political debate on contemporary and historical issues and content. With regard to civic education and polarization, there are 8 specific challenges. First, civic education has to make controversy the starting point of educational offerings. Second, civic education has to employ and develop new digital opportunities to transform and modernize civic education. Third, civic education has to integrate the life worlds of adolescents in youth work and in civic education for young adults. Fourth, civic education has to perceive young people as co-shapers of society and not only as receivers of certain types of education. Fifth, civic education should strengthen the ability of young people to act and to assess information and to assess which information can be trusted. Six, civic education should establish media competences and break up separate life worlds and social realities. Seventh, civic education should explain social developments and enable people to exercise criticism. And eighth, civic education has to be repoliticized in the sense that it becomes and remains an emancipation-oriented focus on core questions of politics. So let me sum up and provide you with an outlook. As I argued in my presentation, Germany is a moderately pluralized society. There is reason for concern with regard to polarization in Germany, but it's certainly not like the Weimar Republic in 1933. In dealing with polarization, the key role of civic education is to enable young people in particular to deal with disputes about conflicting interests and attitudes in a rule-based manner. At the same time, it is important to provide an understanding of the basic framework and democratic principles of debate. By referring to its fundamental principles and by making controversy the starting point for educational offerings, civic education can teach young people especially how to deal with polarization and provide support in dealing with digital media, social networks, and of course, fake news, for example. The latter also offers numerous potentials for the further development of civic education offerings. And with regard to effective polarization, civic education has to address the role of emotions in politics, but it also reaches its limits here. As a democratic political education, it must recognize and mark these limits whenever the democratic consensus on values is abandoned. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
네, 대단히 감사합니다. 발표 잘 들었습니다. 독일의 경우에는 한국과 미국에 비교한다면은 양극화의 수준이 그래도 상당히 낮은 편이다라는 말씀을 해주셨고요. 또 민주시민교육이 양극화 해소를 위해서 어떤 역할을 해줄 수 있냐에 대해서 말씀을 잘 해주셨습니다. 제가 생각하기로는 그동안 독일에서는 민주시민교육이 활성화되고 잘 발전돼 왔기 때문에 오히려 양극화가 지금 수준으로 약화된 것이 아니냐, 뭐 그런 생각도 해볼 수 있었다는 말씀을 드리고요. 여튼 크루아상 교수님의 발제를 잘 들었습니다. 이어서 쯔쯔미 히데노리 교수님의 발제를 듣도록 하겠습니다. 쯔쯔미 히데노리 교수님은 현재 일본의 가가와 대학교 법학과 교수로 재직 중에 있습니다. 15분간 발제를 부탁드리도록 하겠습니다.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hidenori Tsutsumi from Kaga University, Japan. I'd like to thank the Korean Civic Education Institute for Democracy for the opportunity to give this presentation today. Today, I'd like to talk about the civic education in Japan under the polarization. My presentation is divided into 4 parts. First, I will show the current situation of polarization of Japanese voters, focusing on division of issue preference and affective partisan polarization. Then I will talk about super democracy, which is that the elderly citizens' voice is more likely to be reflected in policymaking process. In Japan, turnout level of the young people is extremely low, and it is concerned that it causes division between age groups. Next, I will introduce the condition and challenge of civic education in school in present Japan in the context of the low turnout level of the young. Finally, I show I will show the two cases of the effort of outside school have a potential to overcome the limits of civic education in school in Japan. Okay. First, I will show the current situation of polarization of Japanese voter. These figures by using representative opinion poll data conducted in Japan. These figures show that the change of distribution of attitude toward crucial issues in Japan for the last 20 years. From the left figure, left one, we can find that those who agree to strengthen defense capacity have increased from 2003 to 2021. A red line shows that 2003 and blue one is 2021. And from the center and right figures, distribution of attitudes towards promoting small government and restricting privacy to keep social order have been significantly stable for the last 20 years. Thus, we cannot find clear evidence that polarization of the policy preference for the crucial issues in Japanese politics have been growing. Next, I examine, using same data, thus I examine the status of the affective polarization, partisan polarization in Japan. These figures show the change of the Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, and Democratic Party of Japan, DPJ, and the Constitutional Democratic Party, CDP, for the last 20 years. From the left figure, the LDP supporters' feelings to the DPJ or CDP, their main opponent, had decreased after 2012, but thereafter it seems stable. Regarding the DPJ and CDP supporters, the feelings to LDP has been quite stable. And thus, we cannot we cannot find clear evidence that the difference of feelings of two main parties supporters for each parties have been expanding. Okay. This figure shows that the turnout of 2000 and 2021 general election by age groups. From this figure, we noticed that about 2/3 of young voters abstained in national election, and turnout of young voters has been much lower than that of 60s and 70s. More than 70% of them voted. Under such condition, if there are difference of policy preference between age groups, there is a possibility that voice of the old age is likely to be reflected on policy than that of the young, because in general, politicians are considered to pay more attention to the voice of those who vote than the voice of those who abstain. In present, Japan is very aged society, so such political participation gap might bring the conflict between age groups. So I examined the difference of policy preference between age groups. As a result, from the left figure, I find that there is little difference of preference for the economic-related issue between age groups. However, from the right side figure, we can confirm that the young people more favor to legitimize same-sex marriage, to maintain a nuclear power plant, and in some degree to strengthen defense capacity than the elderly. From this result, there is a possibility that interests of young people are neglected and the young people dissatisfied with government and introduce the conflict between age groups. Of course, we can think that if the young people dissatisfied with the policy making, the then politics making, they would participate in election and vote for the party or candidate who represents the interests of the young. But comparing to other countries, the young people in Japan are considerably motivated to involve social issues for the betterment of society and do not believe the ability to change society. Okay. Next, I introduce the condition of the civic education in Japanese school. Before 2015, in Japan, 20 years age or more were eligible to vote. In 2015, those who are the age of 18 and 19 became eligible to vote in public office election. And thereafter, the Japanese government and various private actors began to seriously promote civic education in school. Japanese civic education in school until then was criticized that it attached too much importance of getting knowledge of political institutions, whereas learning about the real politics and debated issues were neglected. Accordingly, the Ministry of Education and Ministry of Internal Affairs edited a handbook for civic education in school and showed the knowledge and skills required for citizens. In the handbook, students should be able to deliberate social issues from various aspects and form his or her own opinion on them, and to build a consensus among persons having different opinions through discussion with them. In addition, they recommended to study in school major issues for contemporary society, even if they are controversial, and real politics like policy position of political parties and adopt methods which students proactively learn society and politics. These methods are expected to increase the opportunity to learn various stances on political issues and prevent that students are exposed to only biased discourse. However, actual civic education in school after 2015 did not progress as the Japanese government aimed. Although most of high school conducted some classes related to civic education, opportunities which students proactively participate in class or study real politics and election are limited. According to the survey conducted by the Ministry of Education in 2019, only 1/3 of high school provided the classes that students debate or discuss the political and social issues, and only a quarter of the school held mock election, same sitting as actual election. In sum, under the context of low level of turnout of young people in Japan, encouraging political participation of the young people is primary purpose of the civic education in Japan, and understanding wide variety of opinion on issues falls behind that. Considering the situation with historical background that political education in school will require very strict neutrality, organization outside the school may play an important role for support and complement the civic education in school. Next, I introduce two cases which is considered to contribute promoting political participation of the young people and learning consensus building among persons with different opinion, although their main process, their main purpose, not civic education. First case is the Shinshiro City Wakamono Gikai, which means the local assembly consists of the young people living in or commuting to Shinshiro City, Aichi Prefecture. This was established in 2015, aiming at reflect young people's voice to policy making in the city and activate young people for development of the city. The assembly consists of 20 regular members and 5 outside members. The term of the assembly is 1 year. And its most remarkable point is that the assembly has authority to propose projects with budget total about 2 million yen in the case of 2023 fiscal year. It equals about 15,000 US dollar to mayor. I explain how the assembly involved in policymaking process of the city. The mayor consults about policies related to young people to the assembly. Then the assembly members plan the project related to the young people, and about a half year later, they propose them to the mayor. For the planning of the project, some committees are set to discuss the detail of the project. And in the process of planning the project, mentors who are residents of the city and city officials support them. And if mayor approves the project proposed by Young Assembly, they are included in the general budget of the city. And if the city assembly approves the budget, the project proposed by Young Assembly will be implemented in the next fiscal year as a city project. In the case of last year, the Young Assembly proposed 3 projects shown in this slide to the mayor, and these projects are implemented as a city's project. Next case is a social internship program, which is implemented by .jp, a Japanese non-profit organization acting in Japan, aiming to promote political participation of the young. There are 3 programs they implemented. I introduced political internship program in which university students act with member of the Diet, a Japanese parliament, or local assembly, and his or her staff to foster consciousness to social contribution. Activity of participants of the programs decided based on conference between host politician and participants. As examples of activity, investigation for policy making, visiting supporters of host politician, attending local events with host politician, and so on. The program operated like recruitment of the participant and arrangement with the host politician by the team consists of university students in various regions. According to the survey conducted by the NPO, participants improved the image of politics and politician dramatically and is encouraged to vote in election. In addition, working as staff of .jp is considered to have effect of civic education. Okay. Finally, I summarize today's story. As for Japanese voters, there is not clear evidence that voters are divided significantly regarding policy preference and partisan feeling. However, there is a possibility that very low level of turnout of young people causes silver democracy, which is policy making preferred for the old age and dissatisfaction with policy government implementing among the young people brings conflict between the age groups. Under such condition, as a result of lowering voting age from 20 to 18 in 2015, civic education in school have been seriously promoted. But the new idea of civic education, like participatory learning and studying on controversial issues, have not realized sufficiently. Taking into account the context that school education was required strict political neutrality, activities implemented by the outside school organization are considered to provide the young people opportunity to engage in their politics and play an important role in civic education. That's all my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다. 쯔쯔미 교수님 발표 잘 들었습니다. 일본 역시 그 양극화가 그렇게 심화되지는 않다라는 말씀이었습니다. 한 가지 흥미로운 것은 독일의 경우는 그 이민 문제와 기후 변화에 대한 대응을 둘러싸고 양극화가 진행이 되고 있는 반면에 일본은 이제 초고령 사회로 접어들면서 세대 간의 뭐 이른바 실버 데모크라시라고 하는 측면 현상들이 나타나면서 세대 간 갈등 현상이 부각되고 있다. 뭐 이런 면이 저희들에게 매우 흥미로웠다라는 말씀을 드립니다. 그리고 몇 가지 시범 사례를 소개를 해주셨는데 한국에서도 뭐 청년 참여 예산과 같은 제도들이 구현되고 있습니다만은 일본의 흥미로운 제도들, 특히 이 청년들의 정치 참여를 촉진하는 방안들에 대해서는 흥미롭게 들었습니다. 그러면 이어서 세 번째 발제자를 모시도록 하겠습니다. 세 번째 발제자는 장폴 간용 교수님이십니다. 장폴 간용 교수님은 현재 캔버라 대학교 정치경제사회학부 교수님으로 재직 중에 있습니다.
Hello, 안녕하세요. Thank you for this opportunity to share selections from the latest data from Australia in relation to political polarization and civics education. My name is Jean-Paul Gagnon. I come from the University of Canberra, where I'm a social and political philosopher, and my university boasts an excellent Center for Research into Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance, which has run its own programs into civics education. So some of their work does inform my slides today. In this presentation, I'll explain how political disengagement is the core issue that civic educators are trying to address, as the alt or extreme right is not a dominant force in the country. The authors Gethin, Martinez, Toledano, and Piketty demonstrate that Australia shares much in common with 49 other electoral democracies in the world. This, as we will cover, includes political disengagement among most age groups, but especially the less educated. It also includes the challenge of dealing with toxic media, whose dis and misinformation does form part of people's perceptions of the political systems by which they are governed. It is the less educated who are more prone to believing toxic media. More specifically, Australia is tied closely to Canada and New Zealand, or what the authors term historically British dominions. The trends shared by these countries include that people with more education tend to vote away from conservative parties. The more educated tend to support green parties and investment into public infrastructure, such as healthcare, education, and inexpensive public transportation. Confusingly, in Australia, the Conservative Party is the Liberal National Coalition, in which the Liberal Party is the major partner. The National Party is the minor partner in this Conservative coalition. The progressive or liberal vote tends toward the Labour and Greens parties. Substantive progressive votes have lately been going toward independent candidates running on progressive platforms as well. If Labour and the Greens could form a political alliance, this would likely make it very difficult for the Conservatives to win in Australian national elections. In all three countries, the top 10% of income earners tend to support conservative parties. This pits high earners in direct conflict with higher educated peoples, as the latter tend to support the left. The authors term this the multi-elite pattern. They have detected this pattern in other countries as well, such as Peru, France, and Spain. I imagine the case is equally so in Germany. I don't have data for Japan or Korea. We will come back to this point shortly. Aside from Islam, which is on the rise globally in terms of membership and boasts higher political engagement, we are seeing this as well among Mandarin-speaking migrants who are in particular active on the WeChat mobile application. There is a divide in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand between secularists and people who ascribe to one or more religions. Whilst this point is worth further discussion, we don't have the time to dig into this, so we'll bypass the religious divide. In Australia, membership in political parties and unions is on the decline. Some minor parties are on the rise, Greens especially, and independents, or Teals, as they are referred to in Australia, have recently been winning seats, especially at the level of national politics. Some successes have been had at the subnational level as well, such as in the state of New South Wales, where independents won seats in several districts in this year's state election. There is a weakening of the old system in Australia, which is common to numerous other electoral democracies. Some peoples in Australia, for example, hope that this will lead to reform of the electoral system. More eyes are, for example, turning to New Zealand's mixed member proportional representation system, which boasts a mathematically fairer electoral system than systems used in electing most governments in Australia. The sticking point for supporters of proportional representation in Australia is that they wish to see, as close as possible, the numbers of seats in Parliament that should match the number of votes received by parties or independents in any given election. This is the mathematical fairness criterion. Right-wing minority concerns are less prominent in Australia when compared to other electoral democracies, even Germany, which, as we've just heard, presents quite a modest case relative, especially to the United States. Stanley et al. Are, for example, clear that Australians do not reflect climate denial and climate-related refugee resentment as seen in other countries. Whilst the authors warn this may worsen as water levels displace communities in the Asia-Pacific region, who will likely resettle in Australia and New Zealand. For the time being, Australians do not demonstrate this form of polarization. Indeed, Christie Campion is clear that right-wing extremists, or otherwise known as the alt-right, are peripheral in Australian politics. That said, Stanley et al. Do single out the media for exaggerating right-wing extremism, and this is a problem, as such sensationalist media can ill-characterize or otherwise malign the Australian political system without facts, which is information that low-educated peoples tend to accept. This realization has resulted in an increased focus on critical media literacy among civic educationalists. As we have just covered, recent statistics from the politically engaged in Australia show that polarization is occurring between two different sets of elites: those with more education, who tend to be progressive, and those with more money, who tend to be conservative. Interestingly, many of the desired achievables sought by civic educationalists could end up reinforcing the progressive faction. This may incentivize conservative parties to resist the expansion of civics education or to try to reframe it around neoliberal principles and market economic ideologies that suit their policy platforms. Conversely, as more people gain education in especially critical thinking, we may see the further weakening of conservative interests, at least electorally, as higher educated peoples could barrack for a move towards some form of proportional representation. However, the challenge, as I see it, for civic educators in Australia is not about the polarization between the highly educated and the wealthy, as this is ideologically based and conducted by individuals who are, on average, much more engaged politically than the less educated and the less wealthy. As Humphreys, Copeland, and Mancillo demonstrate, just as in many other electoral democracies, so-called anti-politics has been on the rise in Australia for decades. Large numbers of people are hostile in their opinions toward governments and public institutions, a hostility which is rooted in high levels of distrust. So the second real story from Australia in terms of political polarization is then about how civics educators can engage the disengaged. Recent evidence suggests that civic educators in Australia are faced by a double-edged problem. On the one hand, they need to educate people about critical media literacy so that they can understand that the media are overhyping, that is, exaggerating right-wing extremism. This understanding could lead to private citizens engaging more in formal politics and inputting more of their preferences during elections, referenda, and so forth. This sort of training is, however, typically not needed by the more educated nor by the more wealthy. It is needed most by the less educated, the less wealthy, also more prone to being politically disengaged and suspicious of experts or elites. Notably, it is the less educated who tend to believe hysterical or non-factual media. The question of late seems to be over how to reach people who are politically disengaged with advisory information about critical media literacy. This challenge is impressive, as it is especially the less educated who are more prone to this overhyped media that we've mentioned. So advice about critical media literacy could be seen as an attack by elites on their interests. The question is, how does the government reach people with its messaging who may not want to be reached by said government? Whilst the answer in literature appears split, the consensus seems to be about not addressing the less educated demographic head on. Rather, advice seems to center on trying to engage young people and children in schools through extended civics education programs, but also on advocating for the increased uptake of democratic innovations at all levels of government to get more people across most age groups exposed to the day-to-day, interpersonal, and factual realities of governance in public institutions. One example of this comes from recent efforts, more in theory than in practice, to join public institutions, even states, with deliberative systems. Instead of, for example, focusing on one deliberative forum at a time, the deliberative systems perspective asks that disparate deliberative forums, assemblies, parliaments, and so forth, are interconnected or webbed into the non-deliberative practices of mass representative democracy. By increasing the number of these deliberative practices inside a mass democracy, which tends to keep peoples at arm's length, there is hope in educating ever more private citizens in the arts of making public policy. We know from a thriving scholarly literature that deliberative events offer more to participants than just information about public policy making. Participants meet other peoples quite unlike themselves, They learn in depth about an issue with experts on hand. They often meet the political decision makers who will receive their recommendations. And perhaps most crucially, they get to practice the structured mode of speaking known as deliberation. These experiences can spill over into other spheres of life, leading to growth in civic mindedness and private civic capacities. The context in Australia is currently unique in that the so-called alt-right or conservative extremism is not a serious political force. Most people who are active in formal politics are in agreement over climate change, for instance, and are fact adherent. That said, the country shares similar struggles with other electoral democracies. For example, what Holly Corby writes in the book, Building Better Citizens, a New Civics Education for All, about the United States, applies equally to Australia, and insofar as I understand the literature, South Korea as well. Just as in the USA and in South Korea, many Australians are phone addicted. They are digitally nimble, multicultural, and are increasingly becoming post-national or globalized. They tend to live media decadent lives and consume information from diverse sources. This is more challenging for civics education in schools, as this reality needs to be incorporated into the civics curriculum. That requires teacher training, time to prepare exercises, and likely some coordination with parents and/or guardians. Outside of schools, this reality offers hope, as digital social advertising can be used to promote democratic innovations, and it can offer reminders about civic responsibilities. Activists, in particular, are finding more use on this front, as advertising can be inexpensive relative to conventional media, and this allows for counter-narratives to emerge, ones that are typically contra statist representations of civics and citizenship. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate this moment to speak.
네, 감사합니다. 간용 교수님의 발표를 잘 들었습니다. 호주 역시 흥미로운 점은 이 갈등 지점이 상당히 다르게 나타나고 있다는 것입니다. 고학력자와 고소득층 간의 갈등이랄지, 또 저학력 중산층 이하의 이 반정치적 또는 반엘리트적 정서를 완화시키고 정치 참여를 촉진할 수 있는 방안, 그런 측면에서의 앞으로 정치 교육의 과제, 이런 측면에 대해서 매우 중요한 발표를 해 주셨습니다. 자, 이제 저희들 세 분 선생님들의 발제를 모두 마치도록 하겠습니다. 이어서 한국에 오늘 현장에 참여하신 세 분 교수님들로부터 토론에 가름하는 질문들을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 그러면은 발제를 해 주신 세 분 선생님들께서 각각의 질문에 대해서 답변을 해 주시는 것으로 진행을 하도록 하겠습니다. 답변은 가급적이면 짧게 해서 몇 번 순환을 하도록 그렇게 했으면 좋겠습니다. 먼저 신정섭 교수님으로부터 시작하겠습니다. 부탁드립니다.
예, 안녕하세요. 예, 오늘 토론에 참여한 숭실대 신정섭이라고 합니다. 먼저 앞선 세 분 교수님의 발제를 너무 잘 들었고요. 그래서 많은 것을 배울 수 있어서 되게 감사를 드린다는 말씀을 전하고 싶습니다. 세 국가 모두 그 사회적 양극화, 정치적 양극화에 있어서의 양상은 서로 다른 것 같습니다. 세 나라가 모두 다르지만 공통점은 정치적 양극화를 극복할 수 있는 하나의 방법으로서 시민 교육이 굉장히 중요하다는 것이 공통적인 발표 내용인 것 같은데요. 그러한 측면에서 한국에서도 정치적 양극화가 최근에 큰 문제가 되고 있고 이 정치적 양극화를 해결할 수 있는 수단으로서 시민 교육을 강화해야 된다라고 하는 이야기들이 나오고 있습니다. 근데 이제 제가 드리는 첫 번째 질문은 저도 이 정치적 양극화를 극복할 수 있는 방법이 별로 없는데 그 유일한 방법 중에 하나가 시민 교육인 것 같다는 것은 저도 동의를 하는데 이 시민 교육을 어떻게 하느냐에 따라서 정치적 양극화가 오히려 또 악화될 수도 있지 않을까라는 생각을 합니다. 정치적 양극화는 앞에서 발표하신 선생님들도 말씀하셨다시피 이념적 양극화나 사회적 이슈에 대한 유권자들의 태도가 양극화되는 것도 있지만 정파적 파티잔 폴러라이제이션이라든가 아니면 정서적 양극화 어펙티브 폴러라이제이션도 같이 존재합니다. 근데 우리가 시민 교육을 통해서 내가 다른 시민과 어떻게 의사소통을 합리적으로 하고 상대의 의견을 받아들이고 서로 간에 합의점을 도출할 것인가 이런 것들을 배운다면 정서적 양극화를 극복하는 데는 큰 도움이 될 거라고 저는 생각을 합니다. 그런데 문제는 이 시민 교육이 정치적인 문제를 다루기 때문에 이걸 다루다 보면 결국 교육하는 과정에서 편향된 어떤 시각의 기초에서 교육을 할 수도 있고 그렇다 보면 특정한 시각에 의해서 교육을 받은 사람들은 편향된 생각을 가질 수도 있게 되는 거죠. 그렇다면 이러한 편향된 생각을 가진 사람들이 늘어나게 되면 이념적 양극화라든가 당파적 양극화가 심해질 수도 있다라는 겁니다. 그렇다면 이것이 또 정서적 양극화를 이렇게 악화시킬 수도 있다는 거죠. 제가 이런 말씀을 드리는 이유는 한국에서 이 시민교육에 대해서 많은 사람들이 필요성을 공감하는데 사실 시민교육이 제도적으로 정착되지 못하는 이유가 있는데요. 그 이유가 그 많은 사람들이 이 시민교육이 당파적인 영향에 의해서 굉장히 크게 좌지우지된다라고 믿고 있다는 것이 큰 이유죠. 그래서 이러한 것들을 이렇게 극복을 해야 되는데 앞에 독일에서 우리가 이야기를 들었듯이 뭐 일본도 마찬가지고요. 논쟁이 되는 것을 우리가 피하는 것이 아니고 논쟁이 되는 것을 있는 그대로 받아들여서 교육을 하자라고 이야기를 하잖아요. 근데 이게 이제 이야기하는 거는 쉬운데 실제 이거를 교실에서 수행하는 건 좀 어렵다고 생각을 합니다. 그러니까 모든 그 교육자, 인스트럭터가 자기가 가지고 있는 개인의 어떤 편향된 사고가 있기 때문에 이걸 어떻게 중립적으로 교육을 할 것인가. 저는 크게 두 가지 방향이 있다고 생각을 하는데요. 하나는 모든 이 시민교육을 하는 기관들이 각자 자기들만의 정치적인 입장이나 어떤 사회적인 이슈에 대한 태도가 있을 겁니다. 그걸 그대로 놔둬서 여러 기관들이 서로 다른 목소리를 내게 하는 거죠. 그리고 시민들이 다양한 기관에서 교육을 들어서 다양한 목소리를 스스로 듣고 그것에 대해서 무엇이 옳은지 어떤 판단할 수 있게 하는 방법이 하나 있을 거고요. 다른 하나는 어떤 다양한 의견을 가진 시민교육 단체들이 모여서 하나의 그 가이드라인을 만드는 겁니다. 그래서 어떤 이슈에 대해서 찬성하는 측과 뭐 반대하는 측 아니면 다양한 의견들에 대한 것들을 다 모아서 하나의 어떤 가이드라인이나 이런 책을 만들어서 이걸 시민교육을 하는 모든 단체한테 배부를 하고 그런 거에 기반을 해서 교육을 하게 하는 그런 방법이 있을 수도 있다고 저는 생각을 하는데 이건 이제 제 생각이고요. 오늘 그 발표하신 선생님들께서는 이렇게 논쟁이 되는 것을 피하지 말고 있는 그대로 가르쳐야 되는데 근데 이걸 어떻게 실제적으로 말은 쉬운데 현실적으로 어떻게 가르쳐야 될까? 티칭의 어떤 메소드를 어떻게 활용을 해야 될까 하는 부분을 답변을 해 주셨으면 좋겠고요. 두 번째 질문. 예. 먼저 그러면 이 첫 번째 질문에 대해서만 제가
네.
먼저 발표해 주신 선생님들의 의견을 구하고 싶습니다.
네, 그 신정섭 교수님 질문 흥미로운 질문인데요. 우선 그 크루아상 교수님으로부터 답변을 좀 듣도록 하겠습니다.
Thank you very much, Professor Shin Gamsamnida, for this very insightful question, which actually consists of various parts. So let me begin with the easy part of the answer, as I think. Civic education, political education, of course, is not a silver bullet to fight polarization because there is no silver bullet to fight polarization. But as you said, it's certainly an important tool. And as I explained in my presentation, at least from a from the perspective of political civics education in Germany, there is the principle of ideological neutrality that is one of the core principles of civics education. But what does it mean, political or ideological neutrality? It doesn't mean a anything goes attitude. There has to be a minimal normative consensus in civic education, because we are not talking about political indoctrination. We are talking about civic education in a democracy. So the normative consensus, and based on this normative basic consensus, then there should be the principle of neutrality applied to various providers and contents of political education. So this minimal normative consent includes at least respect for human rights, acknowledgement of human dignity, and acceptance of the basic democratic process. So in Germany, for example, we have a very pluralistic, fragmented, or pluralized system of civic education, political education, with state providers, public providers, but also a very large number of societal or private providers of political education, from political parties and their affiliated foundations, Konrad Adenauer Foundation, Friedrich Naumann Foundation, etc. They all have offices in Seoul as well, to unions, churches, social welfare associations, and so on and so forth. They all provide in school, in classroom, and out of school education. They all are united in the sense that they work from a basic normative consensus. But beyond this basic normative consensus, they stand for very different ideas about democracy and the role of citizens in democracy. They all are united by the aim to fight polarization. At least most of these providers are united by the aim to fight polarization. But of course, they have very different understandings of what are the root causes of polarization and what can be done or should be done about polarization. I think for in-school education, which we call civics education in Germany, there the governments can formulate and have to develop a certain curriculum with obligatory, mandatory standards. But for the private providers of political education, they should be given some flexibility. What principles, what goals, what aims, what strategies they would emphasize is generally and in the fight against polarization. Well, I'll leave it here for the moment.
네, 감사합니다. 그러면은 이어서 주춘미 교수님께서 답변을 좀 부탁드리겠습니다.
Yes. Thank you very much for Professor Shin, meaning comments and questions. So, first of all, I introduce a historical background of Japanese civic education. In Japan, civic education or political education is strictly limited, or it was substantially banned in political activity in school. So now, present day, those who engage in political civic education is very careful about political neutralness. So thus, in Japan, it is not a critical issue for biased civic education provided by providers from different viewpoints or ideological point. So, in my opinion, but it is important to balance civic education. So I think most important is learning various views on issue is important, and it is desirable to receive biased education. Therefore, it would be preferable that civic education providers share basic belief or norms for civic education, especially in school education. But in my opinion, there is a fear about norm about civic education, to share the norm of civic education, because viewpoint from minority interest is that often neglected in society. So, and it is not popular for society. So such discourse excluded from civic education is not should be avoided. So I think what important is balanced civic education. My answer is all. Thank you.
예, 최춘미 교수님 감사합니다. 이어서 간용 교수님 답변 부탁드리겠습니다.
감사합니다, Professor Shin. Thank you for taking the time to respond to each of our presentations. In response to your question, I'd like to stress that if we draw from recent lessons in both pedagogical and andragogical research on civics, there is good reason to invest further in compulsory schooling, but also into community-based information hubs, such as publicly funded, typically youth centers and libraries. Social advertising can reach a broader audience, especially adults who are no longer undertaking formal schooling. In the situation of compulsory schooling, teachers can receive training on how to facilitate open philosophical inquiries, which should be led by their students. And here I'm drawing particularly on literature, which is known as philosophy for children. And my colleague who's based in Japan, Kei Nishiyama, is one of the global leaders in this area of thought. So for example, a controversial topic could be introduced in a class, and that could be done neutrally by a facilitator. So the teacher, as both Professors Croissant and Susumi have mentioned, they're encouraged to embody a sense of neutrality, but in the same token, bias is almost impossible to avoid. So it's always there and should be recognized and could in fact be used well if the rules of engagement, so to speak, the rules of the democratic system that have been established, perhaps in the classroom or broader through the delivery of a civics education framework. As long as those rules are adhered to, we can have a really interesting space for students in this case in particular, but anyone participating in these types of events. So the participants could do things like share what they know about a controversial topic. And here it's important for them to draw from their personal experiences. So even, as we all know, I trust, even young children have their own experiences with a lot of quite controversial subject matter. And it's about trying to give them a space where they can be equals to the facilitator and equals to each other to explore those experiences. These participants can then share what they think should be done about the controversial subject, if anything. They could together explore contrasting opinions. They could discuss evidence. So here we have that fact adherence, that return to reason. They could discuss this evidence and see how it relates to any sticking points, any hurdles that the group in discussion may be facing or forming amongst themselves. And at the end of the session, they may wish to, for example, reach consensus through something like a vote. Perhaps they've already formed consensus organically, but maybe these participants would want to go away for further contemplation to discuss the issue with their guardians or family members, friends outside of the class, or just to mull things over on their own and to come back again and revisit the subject iteratively. So in this approach, the teacher is teaching respectful dialogue by demonstrating it as a facilitator. And we know, sadly, that many adults are actually unable or unwilling to perform this form of communication, typically between strangers. So this is a training issue, as most people do have the capacity to do this, which numerous democratic theorists and pro-democracy psychologists in particular have been clear about in their research for decades. I think I'll end there. Thank you.
예, 감사합니다. 자, 우선 신정섭 교수님 질문에 대해서 세 분 선생님들의 답변을 들었습니다. 이어서 한국 외국어대학교의 한성민 교수님께서 토론을 겸한 질문, 문제 제기를 해주시면 감사하겠습니다.
예, 안녕하세요. 한국외국어대학교의 한성민입니다. 저도 일단은 세 분의 발제를 들으면서 독일과 일본, 호주의 시민교육 사례를 들으면서 참 배우는 것들이 많았던 것 같습니다. 그리고 어떻게 각 국가별로 양극화의 상황이 다르고 어떠한 이슈들로 각각의 정당들과 시민들의 정책 입장이 다른 것인지, 그리고 각 국가에서 민주 시민교육의 과제는 무엇인지를 들으면서 많이 배웠고 또 많은 한국에 적용할 점들은 무엇인지에 대해서 많이 고민하는 좋은 시간이 되었던 것 같습니다. 근데 기본적으로 저도 이제 들으면서 들었던 생각은 원래도 그렇게 알고 있었지만 어, 그 독일과 일본과 호주의 양극화 문제가 한국보다는 그렇게 심각하지 않은 것 같습니다. 따라서 그에 따라서 어떠한 민주시민교의 목표 역시도 사실은 양극화보다는 각 국가의 상황에 맞는 목표에 맞게 그 시민교육의 목표가 잡혀 있다라는 것들을 좀 느끼게 되었고요. 아까 뭐 이현출 교수님도 잠깐 언급하셨지만 어떻게 보면 양극화 문제가 드러나지 않은 것 자체가 각 국가에서 민주 시민 교육 자체가 잘 이루어지기 때문에 어떻게 보면 사전에 양극화 문제가 좀 방지가 된 것이 아닌가 이런 생각도 좀 해보게 되었습니다. 그럼에도 불구하고 제가 또 민주 시민 교육과 오늘의 주제가 양극화이기 때문에 양극화 시대의 민주 시민 교육이기 때문에 양극화에 관련된 또 어떻게 민주 시민 교육의 시사점을 얻을 수 있을지에 대한 질문을 좀 드려야 될 것 같습니다. 제가 사실 한 두 가지 정도 질문을 준비해 왔었는데 사실 첫 번째 질문은 아까 신정석 교수님 질문도 그렇고 또 제가 발제를 들으면서 많이 해결이 된 것 같아서 두 번째 질문을 드리고 조금 기회가 된다면 추가적으로 제가 오늘 따로 느꼈던 것들을 질문을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 일단 최근에 이제 한국에서 문제가 되고 있는 양극화는 뭐 정당 양극화, 파리 폴라리제이션이나 아니면은 어떤 그 mass polarization, 아까 뭐 크라우선 교수님께서 잘 설명을 해주셨지만 mass polarization이기보다는 사실은 정서적 양극화, affective polarization이라고 할 수 있습니다. 그리고 한국에서 최근 들어서 많이 논의가 되고 있는 주제 중에 하나가 정서적 양극화를 추동하는 주체가 사실 매스미디어. 특히 아까 뭐 간영 교수님도 말씀해 주셨지만 사람들이 점차적으로 전통적 미디어보다는 뭐 트위터나 유튜브 같은 새로운 미디어들을 활용하게 되면서 어떻게 보면 본인들이 가지고 있는 편향적 정보 선택을 새로운 미디어를 통해서 더욱더 강화하는 현상이 나타나고 있습니다. 그리고 뭐 저희가 다 상식적으로 알고 있는 것처럼 시민들이 자기에게 유리한 정보 혹은 자신에게 익숙한 정보만을 확증하는 용도로 미디어를 사용한다면 사실은 양극화 문제가 해결되기가 더 어려울 것 같습니다. 물론 그 독일이나 뭐 일본이나 호주 같은 경우는 이 문제를 겪고 있지 않겠지만 여러분들의 경험을 통해서 혹은 시민교육 사례를 통해서 이런 정보의 편향성 문제라던가 아니면 미디어의 취사 선택 문제를 해결할 수 있는 방안들이 있는지에 대해서 좀 질문을 드리고 싶습니다.
예, 한 교수님 질문 감사합니다. 그러면은 순서대로 크라상 교수님으로부터 답변을 듣도록 하겠습니다. 부탁드리겠습니다.
Thank you so much, Professor Han Sung-min, for this very insightful comment and of course, a very important question, but which is very difficult to answer. I think let me first emphasize one point that you mentioned in your question comment, and that is the need for more customized solutions for each country. Absolutely, what works in Germany may not work in Korea, and what may work in Korea may not work in Germany, for the reasons you just mentioned, because the cleavages, the conflict lines, the type of polarization, the issues that are at the center of polarization may be different in Korea, different from all the other countries we have been talking about this morning. And also what is considered to be, let's say, controversial, or what does neutrality mean, that may also be different from one society to the other. So in Germany, for example, and this relates to your question, what to do about fake news, social media, communicative bubbles, which contribute then to polarization. For example, in Germany, since the 1950s, we have a rather strict law that is part of our conception of militant democracy, which bans or prohibits certain political opinions from public discourse, like, for example, and most importantly, denial of the Holocaust. That's a crime in Germany, a punishable crime. Obviously, that is a restriction of the freedom of expression, but justified under the principle of respect for human rights, human dignity, and how to deal with the authoritarian or totalitarian past, and how to prevent another democratic backsliding and breakdown of democracy. So the most important thing with regard to your question is, I think, the three central skills to be taught in civic education in Germany are the ability to analyze information, the ability to judge information, and the ability to base political action on analysis and judgment. Civic education impacts knowledge of the social system and its development, as well as knowledge of the political process. But the main goal is to help students to acquire a range of subject-specific competencies and skills. So the role of political education would not be to directly, at least from my perspective, not be the role to directly infuse students or citizens with certain beliefs and attitudes, but to help them to develop certain skills. And these skills can then be used to analyze and judge, for example, information that's been available on social media. By the way, social media is, of course, a huge issue in Germany as well. So it's not that German civic education has found the silver bullet how to de-link polarization and social media, and how to solve the problem of fake news and thought bubbles and information compartmentalization on social media. So that's a huge problem in Germany as well, to be clear. What political education in Germany is trying is to expand media literacy, communication skills, and analytical skills that would help those who participate in civics education to develop the skills that they need to understand what's driving polarization and how to prevent oneself from, or help oneself not to become part of this polarization. So it's about developing skills, knowledge, and reflective judgments. I think I'll leave it with that.
예, 감사합니다. 이어서 주주미 교수님 답변 부탁드리겠습니다.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Han, your insightful comments and questions. So first, as mentioned in my presentation, state of civic education in Japan um, main okay. In Japanese civic education, main aim of it is fostering the ability to deliberate social issues from various aspects through active learning. So, yes, it is expected to prevent polarization, and in actually, the opportunity of active learning in Japan is limited. So I introduce topic of civic education of Japan. In Japan, from last year, a subject in high school curriculum, kokyo is introduced. Kokyo means public. Public kokyo places importance of active learning like debates or project-based learning and so on, in addition to acquire knowledge of law, politics, and economics. These activities in the classes is expected to significantly increasing the opportunity that students experience active learning in school, and they think and debate about the controversial issues. I believe that such opportunities is expected to prevent from polarization in some degree. And regarding the social media like YouTube or Twitter and so on, yes, I think it's a very important point about political polarization also in Japan. So, but in the case of Japan, the young people are very passive to get information on politics or economics and the society and so on. So they don't, most of them don't have the opportunity to receive the biased YouTube channel or a tweet on that from the Twitter. So I think that and the young people in Japan place more reliance on TV and the newspaper, traditional media than the internet media. So I think it's very lucky situation for Japan because they don't much information about the biased information. So in classes, when they are young in school, it is important for fostering media literacy, increasing media literacy to learn the problem concerning the internet, such as echo chamber or fake news and so on, to learn the importance, verify the source of the information and its credibility. I think that this this activity is conducive to prevent from political polarization. So thank you.
예, 감사합니다. 간용 교수님 코멘트 부탁드리겠습니다.
감사합니다, Professor Han, for your question. As far as I'm aware, in Australia, the emphasis has been mainly around fact adherence, and this is to combat dis and misinformation, and political participation. So the idea is to increase the amount of people of various demographics to take part in policy formation and budgeting and many different aspects of governance. And this is done in particular to combat political apathy. So civics education through direct experience in politics appears to be an effective means to inform people about how governments work. It's effective in informing them about the challenges of formulating policy at various levels of government. And it can assist people to understand how governments budget and how governments need to face difficult circumstances in dividing these financial assets year on year and in the longer period ahead. So here we can, for example, rely on participatory budgeting techniques. I think it's most important that we recognize that it's people who participate in democratic innovations that are the ones that tend to become much more informed on average. And it's also them who tend to become afterwards more involved in the public affairs around them. So this could contribute to various forms of polarization, but I think that that could be a good outcome, as this could be based on facts and direct experience instead of, say, mis or disinformation encountered via YouTube or even conventional media. My advice from here would be to try to encourage the growth of democratic innovations in Korea, and if possible, to try to keep track of the number of private citizens who do get involved. And here I think keeping track of adults, those who are not in formal schooling, is especially important in that regard. Obviously, in a way that does not infringe upon their private rights or any civic, social, or political rights. So if this were to be a measure, the idea would be to try to grow the number of adult private citizens in particular who are participating in democratic innovations, and then to regularly revisit more nuanced impressions of polarization through, for example, quantitative batteries. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 세 분 선생님들의 좋은 말씀 잘 들었습니다. 그러면은 선거연수원의 장성훈 교수님께서 토론과 질문을 해주시면 감사하겠습니다.
네. 네, 선거연수원 장성훈입니다. 세 분 교수님의 발제 아주 인상 깊게 잘 들었고요. 저는 이제 선거연수원 소속이기 때문에 시민교육을 직접 담당을 하고 있는데, 제가 앞으로 일을 추진하는데도 좋은 참고 자료 사례들이 되지 않을까라는 생각을 가지고 얘기를 좀 몇 가지 해볼까 합니다. 시계를 보니까 시간이 이렇게 많이 흘러서 저는 좀 의무적으로 컴팩트하게 질문을 좀 드리고 제 의견을 전달하는 것이 좋겠다는 생각이 좀 드는데요. 사실 저는 이제 오늘 그 심포지엄의 주제가 되는 정치적 양극화 시대의 민주시민교육, 이 주제에 대해서 이제 세 가지 이유에서 큰 그 흥미를 가지고 있습니다. 첫 번째는 각 나라마다 정도의 차이가 있습니다만 이것이 세계적 추세라는 점, 양극화라는 문제가, 그래서 같이 고민을 해야 하는 지구촌 공동체의 이슈라는 점이 첫 번째 이유고요. 또 하나는 뭐 잘 알고 계시는 것처럼 이 양극화라는 문제가 단지 하나의 현상으로만 치부될 수 없다라는 점 때문입니다. 우리가 알고 있는 것처럼 사회 구조적인 문제의 결과물이기도 하고요. 때로는 제도적인 문제, 각 나라의 문화와 가치 차이의 문제, 뭐 이런 것들도 포함해서 오늘날 들어서는 이 계속 반복되고 있는 뉴 미디어의 등장, 그리고 그에 따른 새로운 커뮤니케이션 환경의 문제, 이런 영향들이 복합적으로 작용을 하기 때문에 양극화의 문제가 굉장히 중요한 사회적 이슈다라는 점 때문에 흥미로운 것이고요. 또 하나는 오늘 주제와 직접적 관련이 되어 있는데, 사실 이 정치적 양극화라는 현상들이 일시적 현상이 될 수도 있는 것이고 아니면 본질적인 문제일 수도 있는데, 이것을 해결하는 방법의 문제는 단지 정치적 기술만 가지고 해결되는 것은 아니라고 생각을 합니다. 근본적인 문제는 사람이 존재하고 사람이 가지는 그 시민성의 문제가 결국은 이 정치 양극화의 본질을 해소할 수 있는 방안이라고 생각이 되거든요. 이런 측면에서 보면 이 양극화라는 그 현상에 대한 문제보다 저는 시민교육이라는 문제를 이런 종합적 틀에서 한번 얘기를 해볼까 합니다. 오늘 그 사례로 발표하셨던 독일, 뭐 일본, 호주 다 조금씩 차이들이 있는데, 그런 차이점을 이렇게 가지고 얘기를 해보면 한국은 또 다른 특성을 보이는 것 같습니다. 예를 들면 한국은 아주 정파적인 대립이 지금 점점 심해지고 있는 것 같고요. 또 하나는 학교 교육에서 약간 일본 같은 경우는 사례에서 그렇게 정파적 대립이 심하지 않다, 또는 뭐 이렇게 정치적 영향이 덜하다, 중립성의 문제가 심화되지 않는다, 뭐 이런 얘기들이 있는데, 한국은 굉장히 조심스럽고 굉장히 어려운 문제 중에 하나입니다. 보수 정권이 또는 진보 정권이 또는 좌파 정권이 우파 정권이 들어설 때마다 시민교육의 방향성에 조금씩 차이를 가지게 되고 학교 현장에 있는 선생님들은 시민교육의 필요성에 대한 당위는 인정하지만 어떤 방향으로 시민교육을 해야 될지 고민을 많이 가지고 있거든요. 그래서 이런 측면에서 보면 한국 사회에서 시민교육, 특히나 학교 교육의 시민사회가 중요한 키워드 중에 하나는 중립성입니다. 그런데 이제 제가 그동안 시민교육을 하다 보면 두 가지 틀을 느끼는데, 하나는 학교 선생님이 느끼는 중립성의 문제는 굉장히 네거티브적 측면이 강합니다. 어떤 틀에 어떤 정파의 편을 들지 않아야 되겠다, 이런 측면이 강하죠. 왜냐하면 한국 사회에서는 학교 선생님들이 정당에 가입을 할 수가 없습니다. 그리고 학교 선생님들이 선거운동에 관련된 영향을 미치는 행위를 절대 할 수 없게 법으로 규정되어 있습니다. 그런 행위를 하지 않으면 처벌을 받거든요. 그러니까 선생님들은 그 처벌로부터 해방되기 위해서 오히려 더 네거티브하게 접근을 하는 거죠. 근데 제가 생각하는 이 정치적 중립성의 문제는 포지티브하게 가야 된다. 그래서 누구에게 편을 들고 정파적인 문제가 아니라 다양한 양자에게 다양한 정보를 더 많이 제공해서 좀 더 적극적으로 수용할 수 있는 틀에서 중립성을 지키는 측면이 필요한데, 한국은 후자의 측면보다는 전자 측면이 더 강한 것 같아요. 그래서 제가 드리는 이제 질문은, 첫 번째는 독일 뿐만 아니라 일본, 호주 별로 큰 영향을 받지는 않는다고 그러는데 어떠한 기준을 가지고 이 중립성의 가치를 측정을 하는지, 그리고 이 중립성의 문제는 늘 현실적인 문제에서는 이슈와 관련이 되어 있잖아요. 우리나라는 어떤 이슈를 교실에 끌고 오느냐에 따라서 정파성이 확 갈라져 버리는 이런 잘못된 평가들이 왔다 갔다 하거든요. 그래서 어떠한 기준을 가지고 중립성의 기준을 설정하고 있는지, 그리고 어떠한 이슈들을 가져오는 기준들이 뭐가 있는지라는 것을 공통적인 질문을 좀 드리고 싶고요. 두 번째 간략한 질문 중에 하나는, 제가 가장 공감하는 것 중에 하나는 이겁니다. 오늘 선생님들도 교수님들도 말씀을 하셨지만 학교에서의 시민교육이 너무 이론적으로 치우치고 있다. 그래서 더 중요한 포인트 중에 하나는 체험과 체화시키는 현장 학습이다, 이런 얘기를 많이 하고 있는데, 사실 실질적으로 한국은 입시 교육이라는 어떤 독특한 체제들이 있습니다. 그래서 입시 교육이 심화되어 있는 환경에서 이런 체험과 현장 학습에 대한 체화된 교육을 하기가 굉장히 어려운 측면이 있거든요. 그래서 오늘 일본에서 발표했던 사례들은 굉장히 의미 있는 사례라고 생각이 드는데요. 이론적으로는 굉장히 중요한 코멘트이긴 하지만 사실 우리에게는 늘 당위와 이론 사이의 괴리들이 존재를 합니다. 그래서 독일 그리고 호주에서는 이런 실질적인 경험적 교육 사례들이 어떤 것들이 있는지가 좀 궁금하고, 구체적 사례를 들었던 일본의 경우에는 이런 프로그램을 운영함에 있어서 운영 주체라든지 예산 문제라든지 이런 것들이 구체적으로 어떻게 적용이 되는지, 어떻게 그것을 우리가 참고로 이해할 수 있는지, 이런 것들을 부가 설명해 주시면 굉장히 이 한국에 적용을 하는데, 한국 시민교육을 고민하는데 도움이 될 것 같다는 생각이 듭니다. 이것으로 제 코멘트를 마치도록 하겠습니다. 고맙습니다.
예, 장성훈 교수님께서 여러 가지 문제를 지금 질문을 던져 주셨는데요. 이번에는 그 호주의 사례로부터 가겠습니다. 간용 교수님께서 먼저 좀 답변을 해주시면 감사하겠습니다.
감사합니다, Professor Jung. I think to the first question, and I will try to be brief given the time, that in listening to Professors Croissant and Susumi, I think that in Australia, based on my understanding of the literature, when we're talking about neutrality, there is the theoretical approach, and then there is the authoritative approach. So in theory, neutrality can be achieved from either a bottom-up or a top-down perspective. So in the classroom, the students and the teacher, qua facilitator, could establish the rules of the game for themselves. This could equally be done through parents and teachers associations, through a teachers caucus inside the school itself. And there are many different manifestations that could be used or could be the means for presenting said neutrality. Now that's the theoretical purview. Now, if we looked at the authoritative approach, and here Germany, Japan, and Korea have their own rules around this, we don't have as many, I guess, strictures, to put it that way in Australia, but that there is an authoritarian and authoritative dimension at play, which is that the government holds its own understandings of what ideal civic behavior and ideal duties that citizens should be conducting. They hold these in ways that do come through the standard civics education. So if a teacher, for example, were to go outside of that, they could be taking risks and could be facing reprimands in that regard, even if acting against what the government is issuing in its, let's say, required civics education, even if the community wanted that teacher, that classroom to go against it, it's unlikely to happen due to, I think, obvious job security reasons. And very briefly to the second question, I would like to point out a case in South Australia that's a subnational unit, a state inside the territory of Australia. And it's known as the Governor's Civics Awards Scheme for schools in both primary and secondary levels of education. In short, this Governor's Award offers the opportunity for individual students, groups of students, or entire schools to present their efforts. So this is very active in its approach. It is very project-based in its approach. And a small or modest cash award is provided to the students who are best able to demonstrate an impact in their society. So it's really about demonstrating to this Governor General of the subnational unit in Australia that an impact has been achieved through direct and active efforts by a student, a group of students, or the school itself. And it seems to me that this could be an interesting policy to maybe import into Korea if there is no current like policies in play. And that's it for me. Thank you.
예, 감사합니다. 이어서 일본 경우를 제츠미 교수님께서 좀 설명을 해주시면 고맙겠습니다.
Yes, thank you very much for your question. So first question is a very difficult question to answer. In Japan, political neutrality considers that presuppose that there is a position on the issue left, center, and right. It is considered in the school that center is a political neutrality, not left, not right. Center is political neutrality, but it is not standard way of thinking in Japanese school today. Political neutrality is considered that in the school, teacher or students mention left position and center position and also right position. Balanced discussion or balanced debate is considered to be neutral. In my opinion, it is a better or healthier situation compared to the previous situation in Japan. So it's not sufficient answer, but now I can answer. Now what I can answer is that. So second question about the Shinshiro Wakamono Gikai, Shinshiro Young Assembly. This assembly, this council is institution or official institute of the city, Shinshiro City. So the budget is a budget of city budget. So why these budget Young Assembly has a budget? It's this assembly, Young Assembly, is stipulated in a local ordinance of the local Shinshiro city. So Wakamono, this is a Wakamono Jore. It's a local ordinance of sorry. Wakamono Jore stipulated the city make effort to measure securing financial resources for the meaningful activity of the young people. So about 2 million yen of budget can be paid to the paid to the project the Young Assembly proposed. But until 2021, last year, 2 years before, 10 million yen were allocated to the project to the Wakamono Gikai. So, yes, I added the situation of the situation of Young Assembly. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 아까 그 독일의 사례를 설명하시면서 분석력과 판단력 그리고 정치적 행동력 등에 대해서 크라성 교수님께서 많은 말씀들을 해주셨는데요. 장 교수님 질문에 대해서 독일의 경우를 답변 부탁드리겠습니다.
Yes, thank you so much. Really quick 3 points in response. First, the requirement of political neutrality or the requirements of political neutrality are, of course, more demanding for in-school civic educators than for extracurricular political educators like, for example, in Germany, the Federal Agency for Political Education. So for teachers, the requirement is more demanding than for representatives of organizations affiliated with political parties, which play an important role in political education in Germany. So the requirements are more demanding for teachers in school than for extra curricular out-of-school educators. Second, educating the educators seems to be the key. Because what is the basic for political neutrality in Germany, at least? It's the rules, principles, ideas embedded in the German basic law. So that defines the minimal consensus that must be accepted. And beyond that, then there is a principle of political neutrality. But under the principle of political neutrality, not every position may be represented as a legitimate position. So it's not, for example, inhumane opinions must not be allowed to stand on an equal footing with each other. Political educators have to call upon to take a stand for human dignity, for example. This does not mean that students with such positions should be personally condemned or that they should refuse to discuss their position, but cultural differences, ideological differences that lead to dehumanizing certain groups in society, rejecting their basic human rights, are simply do not fall under the principle of neutrality. So, for example, if a certain position is to claim the right to persecute or even kill people with other religious beliefs, sexual orientations, or cultural characteristics, solely because of these characteristics, then this does not fall under the principle of neutrality, at least from a German perspective. So there are limits to neutrality. Third and last, how to bring in practical experiences into in-school civic education. I think we cannot demand of each and every teacher or educator to have practical experience in fighting polarization. I think what is important is collaboration between in-school educators and extracurricular political education organizations or agencies. And they can bring in practical experience if teachers only possess theoretical knowledge. Thanks so much.
네, 감사합니다. 자, 지금까지 1라운드에 사실 그 질문과 답변을 들으면서 그동안 그 민주시민교육과 정치의 양극화 간의 여러 가지 이 내재된 문제를 푸는데 좀 많은 도움이 됐다라고 생각이 되고요. 자, 그러면은 오늘 정말 귀한 분들 그 세 분들을 모셨는데요. 우리 선생님들 지금 시간이 많지 않습니다. 그래서 1분 내에 오늘 뭐 세미나의 감상 또 우리에게 주는 함의가 뭔지 선생님들께 간단히 한 말씀씩 청해 듣도록 하겠습니다.
예, 앞서도 말씀드렸지만 오늘 귀중한 시간 내주셔서 발표해 주신 세 분의 교수님한테 정말 감사드리고요. 그리고 저도 정치적 양극화에 대해서 공부를 하고 있지만 사실 양극화에 대한 많은 연구들이 있지만 이걸 어떻게 해결해야 될지에 대한 연구 거의 없습니다. 그 대부분의 연구들이 결국 이거는 시민성을 높여야 되고 그 시민성을 높이기 위한 시민교육이 굉장히 필요하다라고 이야기를 하고 있는데 오늘 어떻게 우리가 이 시민교육을 통해서 양극화를 극복할 수 있을지에 대해서 많은 이야기들이 오고 가고 많은 배움이 있었던 것 같습니다. 그래서 이런 걸 통해서 앞으로 다양한 나라에서의 양극화가 좀 완화될 수 있기를 기대해 보겠습니다. 이상입니다.
교수님
예,
부탁드립니다.
저도 뭐 개인적으로 많이 배우는 시간이어서 참 좋았다는 생각이 들고요. 오늘의 주제 관련해서 한 가지만 좀 말씀을 드리고 싶은 거는 제가 아까 뭐 크루아성 그 교수님 발제하면서 상당히 인상 깊었던 거는 논쟁을 피하지 말고 논쟁을 받아들이고 논쟁에 대해서 이야기하라고 하는데 제가 사실은 왜 한국의 정성 양극화가 심각화될까 이런 걸 생각해 보면 어떻게 보면 자기 아까 제가 뭐 질문도 드렸지만 자기 편하고만 대화하기 때문이라는 생각이 듭니다. 그래서 저도 이제 학부 수업을 하면서 학생들이 그나마 서로에게 대해서 관용이 높아지는 지점은 의외로 자기들이 같은 의견을 낼 때가 아니라 서로 특정 정책에 대해서 부딪히는 지점이 있다는 것을 확인하는 지점이 저는 서로에 대한 이해가 높아지는 지점이라고 생각하거든요. 그래서 민주 시민 교육이 정말 이렇게 서로 다른 사람들을 모아서 그들의 다른 의견들을 직면할 수 있는 그런 교육이 필요한 게 아닌가. 그게 사실은 정치적 양극화 그중에서도 문제가 되는 정서적 양극화 문제를 그나마 해결할 수 있는 것이 아닌가라는 좀 생각을 해보게 됐습니다. 예.
예, 정 교수님.
네, 그 발제를 해주신 세 분 교수님께 다시 한번 감사의 말씀을 드리고요. 우리가 오늘 양극화 얘기를 하고 있지만 사실은 그 양극화의 문제도 결국은 사람의 문제 그리고 시민성 강화의 문제라는 데는 아마 다 동의를 하고 있는 것 같습니다. 그래서 오늘 이 논의를 통해서 우리가 시민교육이 어디로 가야 하는지 그리고 외적인 주제는 양극화지만 근본적으로는 우리가 이 인간의 시민성을 높이기 위한 교육에 어떤 고민들을 해야 하는지를 함께 할 수 있어서 굉장히 감사한 마음이고요. 저도 좀 더 고민하는 시간, 그리고 고민하는 삶이 될 수 있도록 노력하겠습니다. 토론하신 분들께도 감사의 말씀을 드리겠습니다.
네, 감사합니다. 지금까지 약 2시간에 걸쳐서 그 세 분의 외국 석학 선생님들과 국내 그 저명하신 선생님들 모시고 양극화와 시민교육에 관해서 좋은 토론을 했었습니다. 오늘 보니까 역시 그 세 국가보다는 한국의 양극화가 보다 더 심각하다라는 생각을 했고요. 그런 측면에서 다음 세미나에서는 한국이 이런 극단적 양극화를 극복한 사례로서 한번 그런 주제를 가지고 세미나가 한번 열렸으면 좋겠다라는 제 개인적 바람이 있다라는 말씀을 드립니다. 그리고 오늘 토론을 통해서 우리가 확인을 했습니다마는 각 국가마다 양극화의 지점이 서로 다르다라는 것이고요. 그 해법으로서의 시민 교육도 또한 달라야 될 것이다라는 생각이 듭니다. 특히 그 독일의 사례, 독일은 오래전부터 그 양극화에 대한 이념적 논쟁에 대해서 뭔가 보이텔스바흐 협약이랄지 또 오랜 역사를 통해서 민주시민교육이 이루어지도록 서로 사회 구성 간의 문제에 대한 인식 그다음에 방법에 대한 합의 이것이 매우 중요했다라는 생각이 들고요. 그런 측면에서 독일의 사례도 매우 흥미가 있는 것이고 또 오늘 그 간용 교수님 얘기했듯이 철학 교육이 우리 교육에 좀 도입이 돼야 되겠다라는 얘기 매우 의미 있게 받아들였다는 말씀을 드립니다. 이 지금 대전환기에 어떤 그 결과보다는 과정으로서 개인이 아닌 공동체를 인식할 수 있는 교육이 우리 이 교과 과정에 너무 빈약한 것이 아니냐 그런 측면에서 새로운 커뮤니타스를 향한 그런 교육의 모색이 중요한 의미가 있겠다라는 생각이 들고요. 그다음에 일본의 경우처럼 뭔가 이론적 교육보다 이 실천적 교육의 방안들을 모색해서 교육의 효과를 높일 수 있겠다라는 생각을 해봤다라는 말씀을 드립니다. 그런 측면에서 우리 한국의 양극화가 매우 심각한 상황이기 때문에 우리 실정에 맞는 시민교육의 방향을 모색하고 방법론을 찾아가는 것이 선거연수원의 과제가 아닌가라는 생각을 제 말씀을 드리면서 오늘 토론은 여기서 마치도록 하겠습니다. 참여해 주신 여러 선생님들 대단히 감사합니다. 고맙습니다.
네, 오늘 장시간 국제심포지엄에 참여해주신 모든 분들께 다시 한번 감사드립니다. 이상으로 선거연수원 한국정당학회가 공동 주최한 2023년 민주시민교육 국제심포지엄을 마치도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.